So, can everybody hear me okay? I'm in my studio and I'm right on a busy street, so I hear the trucks. But can everybody hear me? I also have a fan on.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
I can hear you.
okay. So today I'm gonna do a demo that will walk you through the steps I want you to take in the first painting I'm assigning. So the first painting is a very simple painting of a geometric object illuminated by a single light source. So I have a cone set up. I'll show you my setup. And I'm going to illuminate it with a single light source. So all of the work we do in this class, we're going to be using light. First of all, we're going to be using light very consciously, very deliberately, and really thinking about how light functions when it falls on objects. That's a really important part of the kind of painting we're learning. And historically, it was central to the art of painting. So we actually don't think about light too much anymore. We take light for granted, just like we take many things for granted in our culture. So when we walk into a room, we just flick on all the lights, or that's very common. You know, I noticed that at the Queens College studios, that people walk into those studios and they just turn on that bank of fluorescent lights. And so suddenly those studios are flooded with the overhead light. And then, you know, because those studios have big windows, there's the window light coming in. And there's just light coming from everywhere. And it's as if there is total illumination. And then people often will do paintings under that kind of light and not really think about how light is operating really in order to allow us to see. I think everybody knows that the only reason we see is because light reflects off objects, and then that light ray reflects back to our eyes, and our eyes go through an elaborate process of interpreting those light rays. If there's no light, we don't see anything at all. Light's incredibly important to painting, and we're going to be studying it very carefully. So what we're looking at right now is a still life, similar to the kind of still life we're going to be painting today. It's a still life of a very simple geometric object. In this case, a sphere. And it's a object that's been illuminated with a single light source. So, you know, it's been my experience in teaching these painting classes that this kind of light situation is not familiar to people. You know, it's in a way, in some kind of unconscious way, it must be very familiar because we see light this way anytime we're outside, right? If we're outside and the sun is shining, even if it's not shining, but if the sun is shining, then objects are illuminated with a light side and a shadow side. That's always the way objects are illuminated. That's less common, as I indicated a few minutes ago, when we're inside, because of the way we function with artificial light. But so having brought up that about light, let me just show a few sort of randomly chosen images from art history. I just want you all to ask yourself, one, where is the light coming from? And how is the artist thinking about light? So just notice in all of these paintings, and I chose them again sort of randomly, not really, but sort of randomly. Notice that in all of these paintings, the light is clearly, the artist is clearly working with light coming from one direction. Okay, so this is, by the way, early Renaissance painting by Giovanni Bellini, B-E-L-L-I-N-I. This is a painting by Francisco Zurbarán. who was a 17th century, early 17th century Spanish painter. So again, in all of these paintings, notice that the artist is very deliberately thinking about the objects that they are painting as being illuminated by a light source coming from one direction. So they very carefully arranged the light to work this way. Now, of course, part of the reason for that in all of these paintings, or part of the reason that these artists are working with light coming from one single direction, is that was really the only situation that artists at this time had to work with, right? They could either deal with light outside, or they would have light coming into to a room. And at the time that these artists were making these paintings, windows were not as, they were more judiciously used than they are now. So you would very rarely have a room that had windows on all sides. You would usually have relatively small rooms with one or two windows. So people at this time were almost always experiencing light as coming from a single source. So when Vermeer is standing in this room making this painting, he has the window light. He doesn't have the window light and then overhead fluorescence and then a lamp over on the other side of the room, right? There's just light coming from one direction. So this is a 20th century painting by Gabriel Munter. Again, in the 20th century, when artists are still working with the figure, they are not always using the same kind of lighting situation, but very often. So this is Gabriel Munter, and again, just notice the light and shadow, light coming from one direction. This is a contemporary artist named Licia Scavage. Again, an artist, working in her kind of characteristically eccentric, figurative manner, but still dealing with light in the same way. So light coming from one direction and illuminating the object so that we see light side, dark side. And we understand the form as a series of planes that have different relationships to the light source. Now that exact, like what I just said there may not be totally clear to us yet, but we'll talk about that over the course of the semester. So I'm gonna go back to the beginning. So again, so artists are using light in this way, this single light source coming from one direction, again, in part because that was the way they experienced light, much more so than we do now. But also artists realized, and this was a realization that happened sometime during the Italian Renaissance, although there were periods before that where artists also used light in this way, although not in such a fully developed way. Artists started to realize that in order to maximize the illusion of three-dimensional volume in space, again, to go back to what we talked about yesterday, in order to make as successful as possible the illusion of three dimensions on a flat surface, which is what we're trying to do, it was most effective if you controlled the light. And almost always you control the light in such a way that the light was coming from one side of the form, illuminating the objects with a unified light mass, and then allowing the objects to drop into shadow on the other side. And so what happens in a situation like this, the reason that is a very effective way to create an illusion of form. So when I say an illusion of form, I mean the illusion that what we are looking at are three-dimensional volumes that we could hold, that we could touch, that we could walk around. So three-dimensional volumes in a space. So in a space that we could move our bodies through. So that's the illusion that's happening here. And the reason using light in this way is a very effective way to create that illusion is we read these planes that are illuminated. So the planes of this lemon. Those planes that are illuminated are facing one direction because those planes are catching light. So those planes are parallel or nearly parallel to the direction of the light. And then where the object goes into shadow, those planes have turned away from the light source. Right? So the planes in the shadow are moving in a different direction from the planes that are illuminated. So artists understood that that was the best way to create the illusion of volume on a flat surface. If this sphere, this is a student painting. This isn't one of those highly skilled artists we just looked at, but it's a good painting. The illusion of this sphere being round would be much more difficult to achieve if instead of the light coming from this direction, right, it's coming from the right and above, if the light were coming straight on at that object. Because what would happen is we would read this object as a white disk, because there would be very little transition of light and shadow from the light side, which are planes facing the light source, to the planes that have turned around in space away from the light source. Right? If the light was coming dead on from the front, sort of like the way of like flash bulb photography, which we don't see that much anymore, the way flash bulb photography creates that like whited out situation. We would read this as a kind of flat white disk. We may know that it's round, but it wouldn't look round if we really analyzed what we were looking at. So the light and shadow is used by artists to maximize that sense of the fully convincing three-dimensional volume of the objects they're painting. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about how light works when it falls on an object. So what we're seeing in this painting, again, it's a successful painting. What we're seeing is light and shadow working in a way that is essentially always true when light falls on a form. So these series of things always happen. So we have a light mass and we have a dark mass. So I was going to say the technical names for these things, there aren't really technical names, or there are sort of soft technical names. There are technical names that have a lot of variations. Artists will call these different things a variety of different names. But a very common name for the illuminated portion of the form is the light mass, and then the shadow mass. Another way we refer to this, the shadow on the object itself, is form shadow. So that's F-O-R-M, shadow, the form shadow. So I'm giving that a specific name because this shadow here is called something different. Well, anyone know what we call that shadow? It's actually a relatively common term. What do we call this shadow? People have heard the term cast shadow, right? So this is referred to as the cast shadow. So now I'm not going to be testing you all on these terms, but it is a good idea to start to understand, to start to know what these terms refer to. Because these are actually terms that come up a lot when discussing illusionistic painting. So how to create the kinds of paintings we're going to be aiming to create. So again, light mass, shadow mass, form shadow, cast shadow. So then you'll notice variations in both the light mass and the shadow mass. In other words, the values are not all the same. Right? So we have a lighter value here. And let me just make sure everyone understands what I mean by value. Can anyone define value in the way I'm using that term? What does value refer to?
The amount of light or shadow that the object has?
Yeah, value refers to the degree of lightness or darkness of an object, right? So this is a light value. This is a dark value, light value. This is a middle value, okay? And we can talk about that in relationship to a value scale. I'll show you a value scale in a few minutes. But so when we're looking at this form, there are a multitude of values as we roll across the form, right? So those values are occurring on this form in a way that values always can always be seen on a form, on an illuminated form. So what do we have here? We have within the light mass, we have what's called the center light, which is the main light of the object. And then you can't see it so well in this image, but right here, there's a area of concentrated light. It's the lightest part of the form. Anyone know what that's called? What do we call the lightest part of an object? It's another
Highlight?
Highlight, right. Highlight, the more technical term is specular reflection. It's really not used that often, but we can just call it the highlight. Highlight, center light, and then right here you'll notice that as the form starts to turn away from the light source, so it's not completely turned away, but it's starting to roll away from the light source. So the planes here on the form they're no longer parallel to the light source. They're at a more or less oblique angle to the light source. And as the form rolls away from the light, we call that the halftone. Okay. And then we go into shadow. So we can refer to this division between light and shadow here as shadow edge, which is what I always called it from the time I was a student. In the past 20 years or so, just checking my phone here. Sorry, I'm going to let somebody in.
Professor, I have a question.
What
was the term from the middle? Was that half dome?
Halftone, yeah.
Halftone?
Yes, T-O-N-E.
Okay, thank you.
Is it also referred to as the terminator? I feel
Okay, so no, the terminator is the division between light and shadow.
Okay.
So I was just saying that it's the shadow edge.
Oh,
and I was saying that that's what I had always called it. That's what it used to be called. In the past 15 or 20 years, the term terminator has been used much more frequently. And for a long time, it really annoyed me, and I had no idea where that term came from. But apparently, I found out recently that the division between light and shadow on the moon is called the lunar terminator. That's the technical term from it. So artists picked up that term. So this is often referred to now as the terminator. I personally think it's not a very good term, because I don't feel like it describes what's happening, at least in the way we colloquially use that term, but it's become common. So we can call this the shadow edge or the terminator. You know, again, I said these are soft technical terms, as many things with artists. I've also seen it called the line of termination. So all of those things. And then, so within the shadow side, we don't just have one unified dark. So in theory, the light is hitting this object here. So the direction of the light is such that it is hitting these planes on the object, all of these planes that we see with full illumination or partial illumination in the halftone. In theory, there's no light reaching this part of the sphere. So in theory, that should turn totally black. we shouldn't be able to see anything at all. But we can see something. Lena, did you get in?
Yeah, I'm in. Thank you so much.
Sure. In theory, we shouldn't be able to see anything at all, but we do. We can make out different values in there. We talked about the reason why yesterday. So why are we able to see values in here? So there's no direct light hitting this side of the sphere.
Because of the light that's reflecting off of the bottom surface of the...
Right. Primarily because of light that's bouncing off of the surface here. There's actually light bouncing everywhere, which always happens, right? It's called ambient light. So light's coming mainly from this direction, but light has the habit of bouncing. So light's hitting here and bouncing back. Light may be hitting a wall far to the left of this object and then bouncing back. So we get light bouncing from all different directions, which is what allows us to see, even if only dimly, things that are in shadow, because light is still bouncing into those shadows. Primarily, what's happening on the shadow side of the sphere is happening because of the light that's bouncing off of these surfaces. So notice something about what we call that the reflected light. That's the most common term for it. So the reflected light that's reflecting back into this shadow side. Where is the reflected light lightest in this sphere?
On the bottom half of the, right there.
Yeah, on the bottom, right? That's the lightest part of the reflection. And why is that?
Because I think the way that since the light is coming from above and hitting the table, I guess, that whatever that is, that surface on the bottom.
Right, so notice that the bottom part of the sphere is the part of the sphere that's closest to the reflecting surface, right? And these planes on the sphere are most parallel to the reflecting surface. Notice as those planes on the sphere roll away from the reflecting surface, as they roll further and further away, that reflected light gets dimmer and dimmer. So until we see almost no reflected light up here. But as we get down closer and closer to the reflecting surface, we see more and more reflecting light. So light is, again, coming from this direction, hitting these planes of the sphere, then bouncing off the tabletop, bouncing off of a multitude of surfaces, but primarily for our purposes off the tabletop, and then bouncing back into this shadow side. It's the reflected light is lightest here. It trails off as the planes roll away from that reflecting surface. But there's still some reflected light in the entirety of that surface. And notice how that creates a subtly darker band of shadow right along that terminator, or right along that shadow edge. Do people see that slightly darker band of shadow? Anyone remember what that's called, if anyone's had this before? Anyone remember what this is called? So this is called the core of the shadow, or that's usually what it's called. The core, C-O-R-E, of the shadow. So those are the primary elements, and we'll go over these again. And I would like, as people are doing the painting for this week, I would like you to very consciously think about those elements of light and shadow. So then, those are the basic elements of light and shadow on the form. Then we have the cast shadow. And the part of this setup where there is almost no light reaching is the gap between the sphere and the tabletop. Almost no light is reaching here. Almost no light is reaching there. So there's no direct light, and there's virtually no reflected light. So that's the darkest part of the setup. That's nearly black. And that's usually referred to as the occlusion shadow. So O-C-C-L-U-S-I-O-N, or more everyday language, and this is what I always used to call it. It's called the shadow accent. This is the cast shadow. The cast shadow is soft at its edge because of what we call, or what we've already referred to as the half tone. Sometimes you'll see that soft tone referred to with an Italian term, penumbra, Penumbra. You know, it's good to know those terms. Why not? Okay, so those are the basic principles of light and shadow we're going to be looking for. And as we make paintings in this class, I'm going to be asking people to be deliberately looking for those elements of light and shadow on the forms you're painting. So in other words, as we're painting, as we're working from objects and trying to make convincing paintings of them, we're not just going to be randomly copying various marks or patches of light and dark. We're going to be analyzing the forms we're looking at, and we're going to be asking ourselves, on this form, where do these elements of light and shadow reveal themselves? And how can I use them to make as convincing a depiction of form as possible? So this is an image of a sphere with some of these elements of light and shadow indicated. So highlight, the main lights, the main light side, sometimes called center light. Okay, so I disagree with this. Shadow, that's not the shadow, that's the half tone. It gets to the way these terms are kind of soft technical terms, but actually that's wrong. I should have been more careful about using this image. This is the shadow. Starting from the Terminator, this is the shadow. That's halftone. Actually, that's idiotic. Sorry. Core of the shadow is that darker band along the shadow edge, reflected light, and then cast shadow. We also have occlusion shadow here, halftone there, or penumbra. So we're going to be looking at these elements of light and shadow fairly extensively. So I want to, at the risk of seeming redundant, I do want to show a short video because this video makes clear, it's a kind of goofy video. It's a little bit goofy, but he makes very clear how light operates on form. So I think it's useful in that way. And he's able to utilize certain kinds of animation that I'm not able to use. So I think it's useful. And you know, again, I know this seems perhaps redundant, but I think it's important to keep going over these terms because they don't register right away. So I think repeating this is not a bad idea.
Hey, welcome to Proco. My name is Stan Prokopenko. A lot of you have been asking for a video on shading. The first thing you need to understand when starting to shade is how light affects the appearance of form and how to properly capture the three-dimensional form based on the characteristics of the light in the scene. In some of my previous videos, I talked about things like shapes, values, and edges. But how do we know what shapes, values, and edges to draw? What exactly are we looking for? Well, we're looking at light and how it illuminates the objects in our picture. Light is the reason we see anything, and the characteristics of the light can completely change the appearance of the objects it illuminates. So I like to analyze the light in the scene and try to capture it so the viewer can feel the light. Form looking three-dimensional is just a byproduct of correctly capturing the light on the form. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that studying light on form is important. Now let's take a look at all the elements. For this, I'm going to need an egg. For this, I'm going to need an egg. There are two main zones, light and shadow. The edge where the form transitions from light to shadow is the terminator. It's located at the tangent between the light source and the form. In other words, just before the planes start to face away from the light. Let's start by talking about the shadow side. There are two types of shadows. Form shadow is a shadow caused by the planes turning away from the light source. Cast shadow is caused by one form blocking the light from hitting another form. This egg is blocking the light from reaching this part of the table. You can find this shape by projecting lines from the light source to the terminator of the first form, and continuing those lines to the obstructed form. Shadows will rarely be completely black. Light bounces off objects in the environment and is reflected back into the shadows. This is called reflected light. In this case, the light will bounce off the paper and into the shadow on the egg. Along the terminator, sometimes you will see a core shadow. It's a darker plane that defines the edge of the shadow. The thickness and softness of the core shadow can vary quite a bit. It depends on the thickness of the form, how sharp the edge is between the planes of light and dark, or the angle and position of the reflecting light source. Sometimes you won't see the core shadow at all, only if there is something on the shadow side to reflect back enough light to create a visible difference in value. This dark piece of paper reflects less light than the white paper. You can see a drastic difference in the value of the reflected light. Also, regarding the visibility of a core shadow, the reflection has to come from the right angle. If it's directly behind the shadow side, it will create a nice core shadow. If we move the reflection source closer to the angle of the main light source, it will illuminate the area where the core shadow would have been. If you don't see a distinct core shadow, many artists choose to cheat one in because it can add to the three-dimensionality of the form.
So I'm going to continue with that video, but I just want to point out something that he just said, which is important. So he said that sorry, I'm trying to get. So he said that if an artist doesn't see a clear core shadow and reflected light, they will sometimes cheat one in. That's a really important thing to remember, that we're not just blindly copying, or that doesn't make any sense, randomly copying. What we're doing is looking for those elements of light and shadow, and then when necessary, subtly adjusting what we see in order to make as convincing an illusion of form as possible. So that might mean in some cases doing something like cheating in a reflected light or any other element that might make the illusion of form more convincing. And that's a absolutely standard approach to convincing representational imagery. Convincing representational imagery is never just about copying. It's about looking, interpreting what we're seeing, and then arranging those elements we see in such a way that we create as strong an illusion of form as possible.
Reflected light doesn't just affect form shadows. It also affects cast shadows. Less light can bounce into this deep crevice where the egg and table meet, and so that area gets darker as it goes deeper. This is called an occlusion shadow. Moving on to the light zone. Immediately after the terminator is the halftone. These are planes of the form that are partially hit by the direct light. As the planes get closer and closer to facing the light, they will get lighter. And the point where the form points directly at the light is called the center light. Don't confuse the center light with the highlight. The difference between the two is that the center light is the plane facing the light source, whereas the highlight is a reflection of the light source. A reflection will move depending on where the viewer is. So let's say this is the egg. The viewer or the camera is down here, and the light source is over here. The center light will be here facing the light source. The highlight, however, will need to be at the point where the light can bounce off the surface of the egg and reach the viewer's eyes. These two angles need to be equal. If you've played billiards, this is very similar. To test this concept, let's mark the point of the highlight. And mark another point for the center light. Now let's move the camera and see what happens. Okay, you can see here that the highlight moved to a different spot, following the camera. The center of light hasn't changed. It's still pointing directly at the light source. Don't let the math of all this confuse you. Highlights and cast shadows that we discussed earlier can be changed, and they'll still look believable. Nobody's gonna call you on a highlight being in the wrong spot. I can take the highlight on this egg, move it to a different spot, and change the shape, and it still looks believable. I'll often change the shape of a cast shadow to better describe the form it's being cast onto. For example, if I have an object that casts a shadow appearing to go against the form of this paper towel roll is a cylinder. And to show that, I would change the cast shadow from the egg to wrap around the cylinder. I usually try to describe the form that the shadow is casting onto rather than the form casting the shadow. So give yourself artistic license. Learn the rules, and then learn how you can break the rules to improve your drawing. Just want to let you guys know, I'll be releasing a DVD very soon, so keep your eyes out. It's going to have all...
Okay, so I will link that video I will link that so people can go back to that. I think he's, you know, they're annoyingly goofy in some ways, but I think he explains certain concepts really clearly. So just to quickly wrap this up before I move on to talking about studio setup and then doing the demonstration. So we've covered those basic elements of light and shadow. So just to touch briefly on the way we can think about these very simple forms and the very simple expression of light and shadow on a simple form, or the way we can think about that on more complex forms. So this is a classicized, but nevertheless very convincing, complex drawing of a figure. You'll notice that the light and shadow on the figure is doing exactly the same thing that the light and shadow is doing on the volume of the sphere. But the light and shadow is simply hitting a more complex and more varied form. So in spite of that complexity and variety, we still have a main light side, a long, irregular light mass. We have a long, irregular dark mass. Then we have the reflected light, so light bouncing off reflecting surfaces back into the shadow mass. We have the very clear core of the shadow. We have the halftones that roll the form around from the shadow into the light. We have highlights on the form, highlight here on the hair. We have the cast shadow. We have occlusion shadows, where there's almost no light no light at all. So those basic elements of light and shadow occur on forms no matter how complicated the forms are. And I'll send you all of these images so that you have this information. But this understanding of light and shadow, the light mass, the dark mass, highlight, halftone, core of the shadow, reflected light, shadow accent, cast shadow, those are all elements of light and shadow that I'd like people to be looking for in these paintings we do. And I'll talk about that more extensively. Okay. So Now, let me see what's the best way to do this. I'm going to share my phone in a minute. But before I do that, maybe, okay, if I turn my, I am at my studio right now. How clearly can you see my tabletop, or is that not that clear?
Yeah, it's a little bit blurred, but you can see it. I mean, you got people have to double click on your picture to make it bigger, so that you're like full screen.
Okay.
Wait, how do I make it bigger?
Double click on his picture, like on his box, so that his screen is your full screen.
Can everybody do that?
It did not
No,
work.
I can't.
seeing your
You can also, you should also be able to pin the video. So if you go up to
Yeah,
the
Miro can do it.
3 dots up on the top, and if you go up and pin my profile picture, can you see
What?
it?
I'm
There's,
using Chrome. And since you are presenting your computer, and I cannot.
okay, so you know how on the top of your box, there's, you see everybody's pictures?
No,
Everybody, but I mean a few people.
no.
No.
What,
I only see who's speaking.
You only see who's speaking?
Yeah.
So
When you're
when,
speaking, I can see you, but not the professor.
okay, so you don't see the 3 little dots where it says you can pin me to make me bigger?
Professor, why don't you stop?
No, I only see professor's computer's desk.
Why don't, yeah.
I see the
Stop.
same. I also don't see an option to pin someone.
It's like you click on my little box and there's 3 little dots. that come-
No,
That's
because
not
I'm just on my Google Chrome, not the app.
It doesn't matter if you're on your Google Chrome. You're inside.
No 3 dots.
if you hover over the image, there, you don't have 3 dots on the top right corner?
No.
no.
I think it's because, Professor, I think it's because you're still sharing your screen, so we still see
Right.
your screen.
Okay, so if
Yeah, now it's okay.
oh, okay, I see. Now can you see it?
Yes.
Now can everyone see that tabletop?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's not that clear. I have a relatively old phone. I don't want to go to my phone yet. But I think people can see what, for our purposes, I think people can see it. So the first thing I want to show you, just in terms of setting up your own workspace. You know, I'm working in my studio, so you all are not going to be able to, you know, I assume you're not going to be able to set up a workspace like this. But I'll give you some pointers on what you can do to set up a workspace. So this, first of all, is my palette. Okay, so this here is the glass palette. I have a glass palette, and I mix my paint on this. So I recommended that people buy those throwaway palette pads, which, you know, you can replace this with those. You can use any surface that, you can use any surface to mix your paint on that is not absorbent. So you can't use raw wood, you can't use paper, but anything that's not absorbent. So one of those throwaway palette pads is fine. Like I said, you can use a new cookie sheet, you can use most plastics, you can use a sheet of glass, okay? That's the first thing. So the next thing is you're going to want to have a container. So I have my container here. You're going to want to have a container for your mineral spirits. So I'm going to go get my mineral spirits. So I have my mineral spirits there. I use Gamsol. Gamsol is it's the least smelly. It's the safest mineral spirits to use. It's unfortunately expensive. But odorless mineral spirits that you buy at a hardware store is perfectly good to use. So you're going to need a container for your mineral spirits. So that's why I asked you all to buy those 3 containers or have those 3 containers around 16 ounces each, okay? So you can use anything like this. I have a bunch of these empty food jars. So anything like this is completely usable.
I put the plastic mason jars. That's fine, right?
Probably, yeah. I mean, it used to be that some plastics would dissolve in mineral spirits, but that's very uncommon now. Like you can use these plastic peanut butter jars, these Trader Joe's, so that's probably fine, okay? So for your purposes, for everybody's purposes, you'll just, I hope this isn't stating the obvious, but you're just going to put your mineral spirits in your container. And I would strongly recommend filling it up about that much. You don't want to be stingy with mineral spirits because it won't be effective for cleaning your brushes. So I can use that mineral spirits. So why the other 2 jars? Okay, so this is important when using mineral spirits. So the mineral spirits that are in my container, I used them when I was painting yesterday. So those mineral spirits are now all cruddy and muddy from all the paint I cleaned off my brushes. But that doesn't mean that mineral spirits is no longer usable. Or let me just change that a little bit. At the end of my painting day yesterday, these mineral spirits were muddy and cruddy. But overnight, what happens is all of that paint that has dissolved in the mineral spirits settles to the bottom of the jar. And on top of that sludge is clean mineral spirits. So you don't want to use this mineral spirits today and then throw it away because you're wasting a lot of money. This mineral spirits is usable over and over again. So what you want to do every day is you want to have 2 other jars. So I'm going to call one of them, so I have these 2 other jars here. I'm just going to call one of them the transfer jar, and I'll call the other one the sludge jar. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take my mineral spirits from yesterday, I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to pour out the clean mineral spirits into the transfer jar. So this is all mineral spirits I used yesterday and were dirty. But now that's all clean mineral spirits. It's a little bit cloudy, but it's totally usable. And then I'm going to, now what's left in my jar is a tiny bit of mineral spirits and all of that muddy sludge. So I'm going to take a brush. I can either swirl this around, or I can take a brush and I can mix all that up. And then I'm going to dump out that sludge. So now I dump out the sludge. So that sludgy old mineral spirits. And I'm going to put this clean mineral spirits back into my jar. And so I can reuse this mineral spirits. So if I didn't do that, if I threw away that mineral spirits every day, I would waste a lot of money, not to mention it's bad for the environment. Along those lines, you never want to dispose of mineral spirits down the sink. Never. You don't put it down the sink, you don't put it in the toilet. In a lot of cities, you have to bring it to a hazardous materials dumping site. It's not that it's that dangerous, it just falls in that category. In New York City, you can actually just let this sludge build up until your jar is full. You seal the jar and you throw this away with the regular trash. Okay. But again, you never want to dispose of mineral spirits down the sink. If you need to get rid of some mineral spirits, what you should do is pour it into something absorbent, like a whole bunch of paper towels, or a great thing to do is kitty litter. If anybody has cats, or if you want to just buy some kitty litter, you pour the mineral spirits into the kitty litter and then throw it out with the regular trash. Okay. That's, by the way, what the New York City Department of Sanitation tells you to do. Okay, so what I'm going to do, now I'm going to keep this sludge jar, and I'm going to keep this transfer jar, somewhere handy. So you want to hold on to these. These are part of your tools and materials. If you have your paper towels, I have my paper towels here. You want to keep these things relatively clean, especially because you're going to be working at home. Just find some out of the way place to store it. You don't want to store it in direct sunlight. Although I will say that odorless mineral spirits or Gamsol, they are flammable for sure, but they're not very flammable. So they're nothing like gasoline. They're much less flammable than nail polish remover. I don't know if anyone has nail polish remover at home, which is acetone based. It's safe, but you want to be smart with it. So you keep these two things. You want to make sure you do that transfer of mineral spirits every day, and just store these in some out of the way place away from direct sunlight. Okay, I'm gonna put these over here. Okay, so now I have my clean mineral spirits. Feel free to, if anyone needs a reminder on that process, I'll actually see if there's a video on YouTube about that. There probably is. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay, so the way, so in setting up to paint every day, you're going to want to put out your palette. So I have my palette here, and you're going to lay out your paint on the palette. So I know it's not terribly clear, but I have my paint laid out on the palette. I also, by the way, sometimes people ask about this. At the end of the day, if you still have paint left over, you can leave it on the palette as long as you have some place that's workable in your home. And I wrap it in saran wrap, and that way it stays usable. You can also leave it on your palette, and a lot of the paint will form a thin skin, and you can just peel that skin off and use that paint maybe one more time. You don't want to keep using it, but you can use it more than once. Okay, so palette, I have my palette knife, which hopefully everyone was able to get. And then today we're going to be using black and white paint. So I have my tube of black paint, so ivory black, and my tube of white paint. And those are the two colors we'll be using today. I also take out, we're not going to be making the painting with this color yellow ochre, but put that out only as a drawing color. I'll show you what I mean. We're not going to be blocking in the paint with yellow ochre, but we'll be using it to draw. So put it out just to draw. Okay, so I'm going to now transfer to my phone and share that screen. Does anyone have questions about how to set up your workstation at home? So again,
So like when you like I had the disposable paper pad, so you put it flat like yours, right? We just put it on flat and then we work on top of it.
yeah, yes. So you can certainly put it flat. That's the way most artists use it. Do those paper palettes come with a thumb hole? Sometimes they do. Like that old-fashioned palette. Like, is there a hole in it?
No, there isn't.
Okay, that's fine. Some people hold their palettes. Like you've seen those old-fashioned palettes that have that kind of unusual shape, and you can put your thumb through it. Some people hold the palette in their hand as they're painting. That's fine. That's just a personal preference. I like using it flat on a table. When I do the demonstration today, as you will see, I've hooked up a palette so that it's parallel right next to the painting. The only reason I'm doing that is so you can see the paint I'm mixing as I'm doing it. But I don't normally paint that way. But you could paint that way. Some people do that. You'll see what I mean in a second. But for the most part, I think people are going to want to just put the palette flat on a table next to them. It's an easy way to work. Okay.
Do you suggest putting like something underneath that palette paper?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up.
The table?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
I have expensive Pottery Barn furniture. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And of course, that is an issue with working at home. So I'm working in my studio, and so my studio is actually much neater than most artists, but I don't care if this table gets oil paint on it, and it's gotten oil paint on it throughout the years. But if you're working at home and you're working on furniture that you want to keep, clean, then you're going to want to put something down underneath your palette. Because oil paint is actually easier to clean out of things than acrylic paint, because acrylic paint dries very fast and oil paint does not. So you can work oil paint out of most material, but it's a job and it's a pain. So yeah, I would put down newspaper or put down, if you want to pick up a drop cloth at a hardware store, that would be a really good option.
I was gonna ask if a drop cloth was good.
Yeah, a drop cloth is a great option. I definitely, you want to do that. The other thing you want to do is when you're finished with your painting for the day, you're going to want to put it somewhere to dry. So the paintings we work on are going to take a day or two to dry, okay, because we're working with oil paint. So put it somewhere where it's not going to get knocked over onto a nice hardwood floor or a carpet, and prop it up against something, again, like newspaper or a small cutout or a small cutting from a drop cloth, so that you're protecting surfaces around it. Okay. Mm-hmm. I will say that I've done plenty of painting at my home, and with a little bit of care, it's very easy to protect your surfaces in your home from oil paint. But you do want to pay attention to that. What was the other thing I wanted to mention about that? So the other thing you want to do is, I don't know if people can see here, what I actually did was I screwed a Tupperware container. So that Tupperware container is screwed to my tabletop. And then I put my mineral spirits jar inside that. Because I've had experiences before where I knocked the mineral spirits jar onto the floor. And it's a pain in the neck to clean up, even though I don't care about my studio floor in that way. But I bring that up because you just want to make sure that's somewhere where it's not likely to fall over. More because it's a pain to clean than anything else. But you just want to be conscious of that. So, and again, since this is probably an introduction to this process for most people, don't hesitate to ask me any questions about this or to remind you about setting any of this stuff up. So, okay.
Us working in a garage to be okay?
Yeah, it's
All right.
totally fine. Yep. Working in a garage, working in a basement, totally fine.
Okay.
How conscious should we be of air coming in and out? And
You should have some ventilation if possible. I mean, where are you going to be working?
I'm gonna be working in my dining room table kind of thing.
Do you have windows?
Sort of.
I mean,
Technically,
okay,
not.
so we are not using any materials that are highly toxic, that are highly, really in any way. I want to really emphasize that. I deliberately avoided any toxic pigments. There are toxic pigments that painters use. My favorite white is lead white. It's called Kremnitz white. You can still get lead white is illegal to sell for industrial use. Like, you can't paint your house anymore with lead white, but artists can still get lead white. It's legal for that use. Lead, but it's perfectly safe to use as long as you don't get it in your body, right? So lead poisoning happens when kids eat paint chips, or when they breathe in dust that's created by lead paint on windowsills, windows. Having said that, I didn't ask people to get any toxic material. So we're not using any cadmiums, which are toxic. We're not using any lead-based paints. And odorless mineral spirits, in normal conditions, it's totally fine. If you are concerned about that, again, this Gamsol is by far the safest paint thinner. If you have any concern about that, this is, virtually 100% safe. You have to use it in a really extreme way for it to be dangerous. But if you're working in a typically sized room and if you want to have a fan going, if you have a window, you're totally fine. And the Gamsol actually, when I gave you that link, it's actually not that much more expensive at that size. I think the 33-ounce size is $18. So, I would recommend that if you're concerned. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Yeah, it does. Thanks.
All right. So,
question, Professor.
yes.
So when we use the palette paper and we just get one from the whole book and then put on the surface, right?
Well, what I would do is I would just leave it on the book, work on that, and then rip it off at the end of the day and throw it away.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay,
That's the best way to do that. Okay, so what I'm going to do, so let me share my screen now. Okay, I'm going to go back to screen sharing. And then I'm going to share my iPhone. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is this is the setup I'm going to be working from. So I have my cone set up in my box, and as people can see, all I have on that cone right now is the light of the window. So I have a studio that has north light. So it's light it's indirect light. It stays the same all day. I'm not going to be working under this light. I'm going to be using that electric light, similar to the light I asked you all to get. This is what I'm going to be working from, okay? I just want to show you the cone illuminated in daylight first, because I want to show you the difference between a cool light and a warm light. So that's something we're going to be talking about in the class. So the light that comes in a window, so a room illuminated by daylight that is not direct sunlight, so indirect sunlight, is a cool light source. So the light has a kind of grayish blue color to it. So just notice what happens to the color of the light when I turn on the electric light. So I'm going to turn this light on. And I basically have the same light and dark situation. It's much more strongly illuminated. But notice how the color changes. So also you can see in the setup how warm this light is and how cool the light remains on my canvas. Right, so this is what I'm going to be doing the painting on. That still has a cool light on it, where this is a very warm light. So now one light isn't necessarily any better than the other, but you just want to pay attention to those differences. So that's the situation I'm going to be working from. So I would like people to set up, you know, when you're doing your painting, I'd like you to set up something similar to this, okay? What I'm going to do, give me 1 second. I'm going to take a photograph of this, and then I will send this photograph to everybody so you all have an image to refer back to, so you can see what I'm doing, because you won't be able to see this as I'm working on the painting. So let me just take a photo of this and then I'll send you that photo. So, let's see. Okay, so give me 1 second. I just want to send you that image. Okay, so I just sent that image, so hopefully people will have that. And let me just adjust this a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to be working on, so I mentioned that I have a parallel palette, just so that you can see what I'm working on. So can everyone see the setup? Everyone can see the canvas and the palette?
Yes.
Okay.
Or I can.
I see the canvas only.
Oh, I can't see the palette. Yeah.
Can't see this palette here?
What?
No.
I'm pointing to the palette. Can you not see me pointing to the palette?
I can
You
sort of
can.
see
It's just
it.
your phone camera, like the video.
Yeah, okay. I don't know how to get rid of that, so let me pull this back. Can you see that? Can you see it better now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to put my black and white paint.
Actually, yeah.
So this is not laying flat on a table. It's like propped up, no?
This is, no, I have it clamped vertically on my easel.
Okay.
But again, I'm only doing that so you all can see what
Oh, you can see. Yeah.
I don't normally do this, but some artists actually do.
It looks so strange.
Some artists like it because they can see the color they're mixing right next to what they're working on. So, when I'm working, I have a rag. This is a rag I've been using repeatedly to wipe my brush, sometimes wipe my canvas. I have some paper towel handy, so I would strongly recommend having those. You really need paper towel and rags. So I'll be working on this canvas. This is, I actually didn't ask people to buy something like this. This is, an artist called this a mahl stick, M-A-H-L. It's a stick that artists can use to rest their hand against while they're working on the painting. And if people want to get something like that, I actually highly recommend them. You can just buy a standard dowel at a hardware store. This costs maybe $2 or $3, and you can use this. I find it very useful. Okay,
It's just like a regular stick, then.
I'm sorry?
They're just like a regular stick.
A regular, yeah, you can use any kind of stick, actually. You know, any kind of dowel-like stick. You can also buy those at at an art supply store. They're called a mahl stick, M-A-H-L. But you know, they're like $25 at the art supply store. Where this you pay $2 for it.
Okay.
Okay, so again, this page. There are some advantages to the ones you buy at an art supply store, like you can dismantle them for to easily pack them, that kind of thing. So before I start working, I want to get get a couple terms out of the way. So the surface I'm working on, this is obviously a canvas. I'll often refer to this surface, this flat surface, as the picture plane. Again, that's a common term talking about paintings. So the picture plane. And I often like to think about both the picture plane and the plane of vision. So what do I mean by the plane of vision? So let me show you. So let's imagine we're looking at somebody's head from up above. So we're looking at, this is someone's head from above, and that's their nose, okay? And here's one eye, and here's another eye. So again, that's a head from above. The plane of vision we can think about as the plane that runs across the two eyes of a viewer. And this viewer is looking this way. That's the plane of vision. When I'm looking straight at my canvas, my plane of vision, this is the canvas from above, with the staples holding the canvas to them. My plane of vision is square or parallel to the picture plane. Now we're going to be talking about painting objects that sometimes we can think about as parallel to the picture plane. So let's pretend we're painting a box that's parallel to the picture plane. And we may also talk about painting objects that are at an angle to the picture plane. So that's just a concept I'm going to be referring to. The plane of vision, the picture plane, and then planes of objects relative to those two planes. Okay? We'll just bear that concept in mind. Okay. So,
You just dip the wrap.
I can see the setup I'm painting on, but in case the video freezes, please let me know right away. Okay. I'm sorry. Did someone have a question?
I said you dip that into the gamma, the little cup of the mineral spirits, right?
Yeah, I wiped it off with mineral spirits.
All right, no problem.
Okay. So, okay, I'm going to start drawing. So I'm going to draw my cone. Now I ask people to put out yellow ochre, this color here. Again, not because we're going to be using this to mix our values today, but I'm going to use that as a drawing color. If I draw with black, that black is much too dark, so I draw with that. I'll show you that one. So, I'm going to add one element here to our setup. I'm going to add a value scale. So this is a value scale that I have. It's a little bit of a dirty one. So this is a kind of conventional value scale. So a value scale is a scale of values from white to black, and then equal transitions in between them. So we're going to be painting this cone today, trying to accurately observe, one, the values that I'm looking at, and two, those elements of light and shadow. So the main elements of light and shadow that we've been talking about. So I need to start my painting today by drawing it. So I'm going to take some of my yellow ochre, which is a relatively light color. And in order to thin the paint a little bit, I'm dipping my brush in mineral spirits. And so I'm going to start the drawing of this object. So I'm not going to look at that object, and hopefully people are able to pull up the reference photo of the still life I'm working from. So what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to just start sort of randomly tracing around the contour. I don't want to start that way. I instead want to start my painting, start the drawing of my painting, by thinking about what I refer to as the underlying structure of the object I'm painting. So I'm going to be looking for some underlying construction lines or the underlying structure. So what I mean by that in the case of a cone is I'm going to do a couple of things. First thing I'm going to do in drawing this cone is I'm going to draw the vertical axis. So in other words, the center line of the cone as I'm looking at it. And then I'm going to draw a horizontal axis. Those are going to help me draw this cone with accuracy. If I just try to plunge into the contours without setting up any kind of underlying structure, I'm going to, I'm almost certainly going to be inaccurate in the way I depict that cone. So why these underlying lines or these construction lines, or again, underlying structure? Because I know that the cone is vertical, right? The center line of the cone is vertical, so I want to draw it so that it meets as vertical. And I know that a cone is a symmetrical object. In other words, one half of the cone is perceptually the same as the other half. So I'm going to set up that underlying vertical axis and an underlying horizontal axis to guide me in my drawing of the cone. So I know that my cone is symmetrical, so I'm going to measure the half of the cone I've just drawn so that I can easily draw that cone so that it reads as symmetrical. If I just try to plunge in and eyeball it, I'm almost definitely going to be inaccurate in the way I draw it. And we're trying to train our eyes to see accurately in these drawings. Not because that is necessarily an ultimate goal of every painting, because it's not. Certainly not. It's certainly not true that all paintings are accurate representational images. But I think it's very valuable to train your eye to be able to see that. So I've blocked in a simple contour of the right hand and the left hand side of the cone. Now I need to draw the bottom ellipse. So in ellipse, who can define an ellipse for me? What do I mean when I say an ellipse? Does anyone know what that is?
Part of a circle.
Who said that?
Dvora.
Deborah. It's a circle, but what? It's a circle.
Section of. I said part of a circle.
Yeah, I think you're talking about in a certain mathematical way. So in ellipse, if we're talking about drawing in perspective, an ellipse is a circle seen in perspective. So what I mean by that is an ellipse, so the bottom of that cone is a circle, right? If we look at this cone from the bottom, what we see is a circle. But as that circle turns away from us in perspective, we slowly see a distortion of that circle, right? Until a certain point, that circle is just a straight line. And then as that cone transitions again towards us, we see it getting closer and closer to a circle. Anywhere between the straight line and that fully observed circle, anywhere between those is called an ellipse. So I want to draw that ellipse accurately. So there's a rule of perspective that tells us that an ellipse should always be drawn on a horizontal axis. In other words, we never see an ellipse on a flat surface in such a way that its horizontal axis is tilting one way or another. For our purposes today, I don't want to get into the reasons for that because it gets in a little bit too long of a perspective, a discussion about linear perspective. But that's a general rule of perspective. That an ellipse is always going to be seen on a horizontal axis. You can research that yourself to find out why that is. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm drawing that perspective. I'm trying to very carefully ask myself, how much is that circle turned away from my plane of vision? And how distorted is that circle? So if I imagine the totality of that circle, so as if I could see that circle through the cone, as if the cone was a transparent object, I would see a cone, an ellipse that is about one third to 1/4 as high as the ellipse is wide. So you want to very carefully observe that. How open or closed is that ellipse that you're looking at? Be very careful about looking for that. Okay, so now after having drawn that vertical axis and the horizontal axis, I think I have a workable, I have a decently drawn cone. So the next step, since we're dealing with or thinking about light and shadow, is I want to find the light and shadow on this object. I want to ask myself what direction the light is coming from and how exactly does the light illuminate what I'm looking at. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw out that line that we call determinant. The line that divides the light planes of this object and the light planes of this object are planes that are facing this direction, right? Our light is coming like this. The light is coming from slightly above on the left. The light's coming in that direction. And so the light is hitting these planes on the object. And then just about at this point on the cone is when the planes on the cone fully turn away from that form. Fully turn away from the light source. So the cone goes into shadow from here over to the right. So this is the terminator for the shadow edge. And then we have in this setup a cast shadow. In this case, fairly closely recreates the
Professor,
the cone itself. Yes?
is there any way that you can put the computer kind of towards you more so we can hear you louder?
Oh, sure. Sorry. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and I'll try to speak louder. Okay, so thanks for letting me know. Because I can't tell those kind of things. And, this kind of teaching is still relatively new to me. So you can all hear me now as I'm talking?
Yeah.
Okay, so then what I'm drawing right now is the point where the surface of the interior of that box meets the back wall of the box, okay? So I have my contour of the cone. I have the surface that the cone is sitting on, which is moving backwards in space like this. I have my light side, dark side, and then I've drawn the cast shadow. And again, that cast shadow is a cast shadow that pretty much reflects or it pretty much repeats the shape of the cone, which often happens depending on the clarity of the light source and the sharpness of the light source. Okay, so I've drawn the painting, or I've drawn my object so that I can now start blocking in. And I have a relatively long canvas compared to the height. I'm going to approach this painting as if the painting ends here. I'm going to use this actually to write some stuff as I do this painting. So let's pretend my painting or my canvas is this square. So now I want to understand the way I can create a convincing sense of the volume of this object in a convincing representation of the space of, in this case, the box, right, or the space of the environment it is sitting in. I want to get a sense of this plane moving convincingly backward in space, in perspective. I want the angle of this plane to read as different from the angle of that plane. And I want this cone to read as a fully convincing round volume in that space. So I'm going to be looking at those elements of light and shadow and asking myself how those elements of light and shadow reveal those properties of the object and the space I'm looking at. So I started drawing with this small filbert. This is a number 1 filbert. I'm going to block in now with this number 4 filbert. Okay. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to block in the value of the background and the value of the top of the table. I want to block in those value masses so I can use those value masses to accurately judge the value of the cone that I'm painting. I'm going to do those first to help me very accurately see the values of the cone. So I mentioned that I have this value scale here. When I'm looking at those values, what I'm in effect doing is asking myself how light or how dark is that value. So we could think about it in terms of the value scale if it helps make things clear. For example, as I look at the back wall of the cone, back wall behind the cone, what value is it? It's certainly not white. It's certainly not black. So where is it in this range of values? So the first thing I'm going to do, obviously, is look at that value. And then I'm going to take my white paint and my black paint. And I'm going to mix up the value that I think approximates the value of that background. Now, as I'm looking at my value scale and I'm comparing it to that background, to me, the value looks to be around this kind of gray. Right? So I'm only dealing with value. I'm not asking myself what color that is because we're not working with color yet. We're just dealing with value. So it's around that value. It's probably not exactly that middle gray, but it's around that value. And so I'm going to start with a value roughly like that. And this may change. That may not be exactly the value. And it's very hard to tell exactly what the value, at least for me, it's hard to tell exactly what the value is until I get down a whole range of other values. So I start by just broadly blocking in the value of the background. So I am not looking at any details. I am just blocking in the broad overall value. I'm blocking in just that big value that I've identified the background to be. So as people can see in the photograph of the setup I'm working from, the back of the box is corrugated cardboard. So now no one may have the impulse to do this, but I am certainly not going to try to indicate any of the details of that corrugated cardboard. So in the kind of painting we're doing, you always want to work from the very broadest, from the very large masses, from the very large values to the small values. You never want to start with the details.
Professor, the technique that you're showing us right now, where we have the cone inside of the cardboard box, is that something that we need to do? Is that something specific for the lighting that we're going to need to observe?
Yes, the reason for that, the reason I ask you to get a cardboard box and to set it up this way is that most people don't have ideal conditions to be dealing with a simple light and dark setup. So you're probably going to have light coming from other directions in the room you're working in. And so setting up a cone in a box allows you to block light from most directions, but have the light coming from one main direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. I just wanted to be sure that that we needed to place our object, our form, inside of a cardboard box.
Yeah, so if you're able to work in a room where you truly have just the light coming from just one direction, then you could skip the cardboard box. But most people don't have that situation. So most people have a situation where the room they're working on probably has light coming from multiple directions. So you want to create a situation where you truly are looking at an object illuminated with a single light source.
Okay, I understand. So we're just trying to manipulate the light to have one single light source.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm blocking it. I've thinned my paint a little bit.
We don't have that value scale, do we? We didn't order.
No, I didn't ask people to make one or to buy one. I probably should have, because you can buy them inexpensively. But you don't need to. I really have it here. I typically don't teach with a value scale, or I don't always have my students buy one. I did do that once with a class. You don't have to have it, but you know it is helpful.
You might be able to just go to like a painting store, but like for a house painting.
Possibly.
And like I had that thought when I saw you bring it out to go to like, I don't know what's like AC Moore or something like that.
I know, yeah, like Keller Williams, any of one of the painting stores, they have.
Yeah, and just
the problem is
watches
that they're not necessarily the same color. Sometimes it's just in that color family.
You can definitely get them at Blick, and you can also probably download a decent one. Because it doesn't have to be exact, because you're not going to be matching. I'm not trying to match that value exactly. I'm just using it as a rough guide.
Okay.
So you can probably just look one up online and download one that will work as a pretty decent rough guide. So I've blocked in roughly the background. And for some reason on the screen that you're all looking at, that looks a little bit more brushy than it is. Okay, so now you can't look at the setup exactly that I'm looking at, but I think you can see it in the image I sent. The surface of the tabletop is a little bit lighter than the surface of the back wall. So I'm going to mix up a gray that I think approximates the relative lightness of that surface. And I'm going to lay down
Professor, which number brush are you using for now?
This is a number 4.
Can we use number 6 for this?
Yes, you can use a number 6. And you don't have to be precious with your drawing. So I'm not worried at this stage about staying right in the lines. Because I can redraw as when I get to the point where I'm blocking in the lights and shadows on the cone. Actually, you asked about using number 6. I'm going to go with a number 6 right now. I'm going to change to a number 6 because there's no reason not to use a larger brush on this area.
You're going so fast, not in a bad way, but it just looks like we're fast forwarding a video.
Well, what I'm looking for are large masses. So I don't need to, all I want to do right now is block in, that big area of value. So I'm identifying the entirety of the surface that the cone is sitting on as one value mass. I'm not making any variations within that value mass yet. I certainly will, but I'm not doing that yet. So there's no reason not to block in broadly, if that makes sense. And some people, people tend to get very tentative when working on the painting in this stage. Like they get tentative because I guess they don't want to make any mistakes. But there's no reason not to make mistakes at this point. And you have the rest of the painting to correct them or adjust them. And what we want to get down right now is just a broad statement of the large values that we're looking at. Again, we don't want to get involved in any kind of detail at this point.
What type of canvas are you using?
Well, I have a stretched canvas. I can show you at the end. This is a traditional stretched canvas. So this is canvas stretched over. I'll show you. It's a piece of canvas stretched over these stretcher bars. So when we're doing these early paintings in painting 1, I don't have people buy stretched canvas. And also, for this class, I was very conscious of making the supplies as affordable as possible. So you're going to be working on a canvas board. It's perfectly acceptable. I mean, certainly if people wanted to buy stretched canvases, or if people want to stretch their own canvas, which I usually do in this class. I usually teach people how to do that. I'm not going to do it because we're doing this online. I just don't think it's I did have to cut back on some of what we teach just because of the demands of teaching online. But if anyone wants to try a stretched canvas, I can point you in the direction of good demonstrations, and I can let you know what you should buy. But this is, and the only reason I'm doing it on this is I had it handy.
Are we doing this on the we're doing this on the 12 by 16 canvas that you told us to do it on? Okay.
Yeah.
The canvas pad is for something else.
Yeah, it's best not, I mean, the canvas pad would work. And if you want to do these first paintings on the canvas pad, that's fine. So again, I'm just blocking in, I'm blocking these elements in broadly. I'm not looking for any detail. I'm not, paying attention to subtle transitions. I just want to get big masses of value down so I can start making, so I can start to make those finer transitions of value. So people will often ask at the beginning of a painting process with oil paint, will wonder about these, this kind of inconsistency in the coverage. In other words, the way you still see some brush strokes. That's nearly unavoidable with oil paint. So really oil paint is designed to be developed in layers. Not in just one layer where you totally cover everything. I'm using a fan brush right now to just unify some of those areas. I didn't ask people to buy a fan brush, but if anyone wanted to.
I have one from last class.
You can use, I mean, these you can just give a kind of blend to areas. Okay, so I have the large mass of light of the background, and then of the back wall, and then the surface that the cone is sitting on. And I think for my initial purposes, those values look okay. I'm not saying that I'm definitely going to stay with those values exactly, but I think they work right now as a block-in. So you'll notice I left that cast shadow blank. That's the shadow that's created because this cone is blocking light from hitting that surface. So I always want to paint in separate masses of light and shadow. I don't want to make this very common mistake when people first start painting with oil paints, which is to put down a value everywhere and then try to paint the shadow into the wet paint that you've used for the light area of the object you're painting. You want to paint these as separate areas for a couple reasons. One, you want to be very conscious of looking at values of light and shadow. So you don't want to be thinking in terms of sort of coloring in just a big local, a large mass of local value. But also because oil paint, it doesn't work very well when you try to change a wet layer of color. Because this paint is going to stay wet, and no matter what you put down on top of that, the wet paint underneath is going to affect the color you put down. So I'm always going to be painting lights and shadows as separate areas of color. or in this case, separate areas of value. So again, what I'm doing is I'm taking a dry brush and I'm just lightly unifying some of these areas. I can recommend some kinds of brushes you could get to do this. Okay, so now I want to look at the value of the light mass and the dark mass on the cone and the value of the cast shadow relative to the values I've already put down. So what I mean by that is I've looked at the value of the background of my setup. I've looked at the value of the tabletop in my setup. This is a middle gray value. A middle gray value maybe tending towards the dark. This is a middle gray value tending towards the light. And when I look at the value of the light side of that cone, I see that it's considerably lighter than either of these two values. So I'm going to make sure I paint this value so that it is distinctly, clearly lighter than either of those two values. And then the value of the shadow side of this cone is clearly darker than the values of the back wall or the surface of the table. And I want to make sure I take that into account when watching these values. So the value on the, I'm going to start with the value on the dark side of the cone. So I'm going to take my black and I'm going to mix a dark, a gray that is darker than those that I started with and the gray that I started with in the background. And I'm going to very simply, again, working very broadly, I'm going to lay in the color of that large value mass.
Professor?
Yes.
So before you put the oil paint, you just dip into the mineral spirits?
Yeah, if I need to thin the oil paint, I'll just dip it into mineral spirits, just so that I can slightly make the oil paint slightly more liquid. You don't want to do it too much. You don't want to thin the oil paint so that it's too liquidy. But if it's a little bit too stiff to use right out of the tube, you can thin it with mineral spirits.
Okay.
You can also thin it with something called painting medium, but we don't have that yet. I can talk about that at a later date. Painting medium helps you do other things.
Okay, but the mineral sprays normally we use to make the oil paint a little liquid.
Yes.
And wash our brush, right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay, got it.
And then the other thing the mineral spirits does is you can use it to clean your brush.
And also use that to, like just now you use the rag to erase what you draw.
Right. You can use the rag to erase, and you can dip it in a little bit of mineral spirits, and that'll help you erase what you've drawn.
Okay, thank you. But normally we don't use a pencil to like the sketch.
If you really want to, you can. I don't think it's necessary. And working with a graphite pencil gets a little bit dicey, or it can actually, graphite pencil can create some problems for oil paint. If you really want to start with a graphite pencil, you can, because the problem, you're not going to be using enough graphite to really genuinely create problems for the paint surface. But in theory, anyway, graphite can create a kind of greasy layer on the canvas. Like if you think about graphite pencil, it has a kind of greasy quality to it. And it can create a layer on the canvas that will prevent the oil paint from really binding with the canvas.
Okay.
But having said that, you do have to use a lot of graphite to have that be a problem. So if you're more comfortable working with, you're more comfortable starting the drawing with a graphite pencil, that's fine.
Okay.
I just don't think it's necessary.
Okay.
I've started blocking in the shadow mass on that cone in a very simple way. I've just seen, I've simplified the shadow shape to one unified shape. So that's a start. Obviously, we're not going to leave the painting that way. But I would like people to think about the light and shadow in a very simple, large way. Don't get bogged down in details at this point. Now, something I'm looking at is, after I've laid down that shadow pattern, that shadow color, or that shadow value, I should say, I'm just asking myself, is it the right value compared to the values next to it? So is the value of the shadow mass the right value compared to the value of the wall behind it and the surface of the table? And I think it's about the right value. Again, the photograph I've sent is not going to quite capture the values that I'm looking at. I think it's about the right value. I do think perhaps the value of the background next to the value of the form shadow on the cone should be just a little bit lighter. So I'm going to lighten the value of the background where it meets the form shadow on the cone just a little bit. I'm going to soften that out into the value of the background around it.
This is because that's where the light is hitting, right? I'm looking at the picture on my phone.
It's because it's created, because this form shadow is so dark.
Yeah.
We read the value of the wall behind it as considerably lighter. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because of that contrast.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
So
I'm looking at the picture at the same time as you're drawing it. I mean, painting.
I'm trying to just create a clear sense of the clarity of that contrast. By the way, I didn't speak about this as I was doing it. I put in that sharp line at the bottom of the cone because I wanted to clarify the shape, first of all. But also, if you notice at the bottom of the cone, what we get there is a little sliver of occlusion shadow, right? It's a little gap between the cone and the surface of the table where there's no light getting there. So I did that to clarify the drawing, but also to indicate that occlusion shadow just underneath, just at the bottom of the cone where the cone meets the tabletop. So again, if I mentioned always painting light masses and shadow masses as separate shades. And again, the reason for that is if I try to be painting this shadow value into wet paint, the wet paint would constantly be bleaching this out. So I would never be able to achieve that shadow value. So now I'm going to be drawing I'm going to be painting the cast shadow. So if you look at that reference image I sent you, you'll notice that there's a fairly bright reflected light on the form shadow right around here. There's actually reflected light on the entire length of the form shadow, but it's brighter at the bottom where the surface of the cone is closer to the surface of the table. Is that visible in that reference photo I sent people?
Yeah, you can see it. It's a little bit brighter there at the bottom where you're pointing.
Okay, so I'm not going to indicate that yet. I'm first going to, I'm not going to worry about that yet. This is a general tone for the shadow side of the cone.
Okay.
The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the dark overall value of the cast shadow. So that's also a dark, a very dark shadow. But you notice as I'm painting it right now, I'm not making any distinction, or I'm making barely any distinction between the value of the form shadow near the surface of the table and the value of the cast shadow. I will go in there and make that distinction. But because I'm working with just the large masses of value right now, I'm not going to worry about that until I have all of the large values blocked in. So I'm blocking in just the large value of the shadow shape, and I'm trying to take note of the shape and angle of that cast shadow. Again, I don't need to worry about details. Which isn't to say we're not going to paint them, but I'm just not looking at details at this stage of the painting. I'm just looking at the very large masses of lights and shadows. Now, having said that about looking at the large masses of light and shadows, at the same time, you don't want to be working in such a way that you just have very sharp shape, very sharp divisions between the shadow and the light. And that's fine at the very initial stage. But I do just want to say that right now, I think it's a good time to at least indicate some of the softness of those shadow edges. So I'm going to mix a mid-tone value, and I'm going to sort of stitch in mid-tone value, just to indicate the softness of that value, or what we sometimes refer to as the penumbra.
As the what? What was that word?
Penumbra, P-E-N-U-M-B-R-A. It's that transitional value. It's kind of halftone or a, don't worry about the tone penumbra. I mean, that you encounter that sometimes, but it's really, you can really just refer to that as the halftone.
Do you suggest we have this like extra brush so that we could like do what we're doing right now, kind of like?
Yeah, I mean, I like working that way. Some artists don't, but I always like using a dry brush to just make those transitions. So yeah, if you have an extra brush that you keep dry, it's useful to have that to do any blending or any cleaning up like that. So before I start painting the light mass, I'm just going to clarify this edge a little bit. Can people still hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so now I want to paint the light mass of the cone. And again, the light mass of the cone is considerably lighter than the background or the surface of the table. This cone is made out of, literally I made it out of a old file folder. So it's not quite white. It's that kind of pale yellow of old file folders. But it's nearly white. It's going to be a very, very light gray, right? As I'm looking at how bright it is under this light situation, it's nearly white. So I'm going to block in a very light tone. Now here you'll see that I may end up having to darken around this cone. But I don't want that value to quite be white, because it's not quite white.
Did you make that thing? You bought that thing that you're resting your hand on?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
You're resting your hand on. You keep putting it back to rest your hand on.
Yeah, so that's just the mall stick
Okay.
that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very useful. Some artists don't use it. Some artists put their pinky on the surface and support their hand that way. Some artists don't use anything at all. Some artists just hold their brush away from the canvas. I mean, you can do that. I find it a little bit harder. I love the mall stick.
I don't have a steady hand, so that might be something that I need to get.
Yeah, it helps. I mean, I find it very useful in helping to steady your hand. I mean, and also it's especially useful to me right now because because this tripod and the phone is in my way, so I'm in a kind of awkward position in relationship with the canvas. I'm actually standing much further away from the canvas than I normally would. Okay, so I've now blocked in, or nearly blocked in, the main mass of light and shadow. Now, I know, especially people who maybe this is their first stab at oil painting or representational painting. I imagine people are saying, well, that is obviously much too simplified compared to the complexity and variety of information that we can see in the setup. So, and you all just have a photograph of the setup I'm working from. But even in that, you can see that there's much more complexity than I'm indicating here. And obviously that's true. But the best way to get at that complexity is to start by blocking in as accurately as possible the very large masses of value. And when we get to color, we'll be saying the same things about color. So what have we started with? We started by identifying value relationships. So what's the value of the light mass of the cone compared to the back wall, compared to the surface of the table? What's the value of the light mass of the cone compared to the form shadow? What's the value of the form shadow compared to the back wall of the box? So the form shadow is darker than the back wall of the box. The light mass is considerably lighter than that back wall and then the surface of the table. I've blocked in those big masses fairly convincingly. So now starting to build up further information, I'm starting to analyze the setup and ask myself, how is the light falling on this form in such a way that the form reads convincingly as a round object? It's much easier to now go into this block in and start building up those complex elements of light and shadow. I don't want to arrive at a convincing unity of value and volume by chaining up a lot of little events. Like I don't want to look at separate areas of value or separate areas of color and sort of chain them up and hope that in the end I have a sense of a unified light source, a sense of a unified value structure. Instead, I want to establish very clearly at the start the unified value structure, which is what this is called. This is the simplified value structure of the painting. A sense of the unified light source. I want to set up those large things and then go into those smaller details. So what else do I see on that cone that's not yet in my painting? So the first thing I see is a halftone that transitions the dark into the light. Or that's the first thing I'm going to look for. In other words, there isn't this sharp edge between the shadow and the light. There's a softness that's created by a halftone. So now what's the value of that halftone? So obviously it's somewhere between this value and this value. So I'm going to mix a middle gray value that will approximate the value of that halftone. And similar to the way I did with the edges of the edge of the cast shadow, I'm gonna scrub in or lay in that halftone. So in a gradation from light to shadow on a form, no matter what the form is, in this case, this very simple form of the cone, the gradation isn't an absolutely even gradation where there's a transition from dark to light with no perceivable distinctions between those different gradations, right? So no matter how smoothly I render this form from light into shadow, I still want to be able to clearly distinguish or clearly make out that terminator, right, or that shadow edge. I don't want to lose the shadow edge in a gradation that entirely eliminates those distinctions, right? So there's a softness, but it's not a softness that eliminates the distinction between the light mass and the dark mass. It's a softness that, as I look at this cone, to me is something like this. I brought in that halftone. There's a softness that does something like that. So I'm going to go back to my dry brush. I'll just use my dry brush to just modify those tones a little bit. Now, I don't need, in order to start to develop a really convincing representation of a believable object in space, I don't need a huge range of value differences. I can work within a relatively simple value range and still make a convincing representation of an object in space. So I've started to indicate the halftone on that form, the transition, again, transitions the shadow into the light, or the light into the shadow, however you want to say it. I'm just softening a little bit more these edges of the cast shadow. So if we remember those elements of light and shadow we talked about, like light mask, dark mask, halftone, we talked about the reflected light. Right? The fact that light is passing by the object and hitting surfaces around it and then bouncing back into that shadow mask. So there's reflected light as I look at that cone. The reflected light is lighter near the bottom of the cone, where the bottom of the cone is closer to the reflecting surface, and it diminishes until it nearly disappears near the top of the cone. So I'm going to take some of my lighter gray, and I'm going to paint wet into wet and bring in that reflected light. So the reflected light trails off or diminishes as we move up the cone, and the cone gets further and further away from reflecting surfaces. But it's quite strong near the bottom of the cone. A really important rule of light and shadow is that you never want anything in the shadow mask to be as light as anything in the light mask. So you want to make sure that you're not painting your reflected light so that it's anywhere near as light as anything on the light side of the form. It has to stay believably within the shadow mask. It's a reflected light, and it's a lighter area of the shadow mask, but it's not anywhere near as light as anything on the light side of the form. So this blending I'm doing, in part the reason I'm doing it is because as you're looking at this painting captured by the camera, because of the angle of the light and the angle of the camera for the painting, you're seeing the brush strokes much more visibly than I am as I'm looking at it. So I'm trying to eliminate those to some extent. This is also a bit of a personal preference. So if you're not as interested in making this kind of unified transition between the values, that's fine. If you want to work in a more, in a broader way, that's a stylistic choice. As long as you're creating a convincing sense of light, I mean, a convincing sense of light and shadow and a convincing sense of the volume of the object. So I'm just working this shadow edge to try to develop that transition. And so again, students will often ask me about getting down a totally unified surface with no indication of the brush strokes. That's really not possible on a first layer of oil paint. You have to block in this layer that unavoidably has visible brush strokes. And then if you wanted to develop the painting so that you had a completely unified, a completely smooth transition between those tones, you'd have to do at least a second layer. You'd have to let the painting dry and then do a second layer. So with this painting, to continue to develop the transitions and to get the softness of transition convincing, I would keep slowly working these tones together. I'm going in with a little bit of that lighter gray that I used for the reflected light and just sort of nudging the transition between these tones. Again, without losing the clarity of the lights and shadows. So, and people can probably hear me tapping my brush on the mineral spirits jar. So I'm constantly cleaning my brush. I don't want to be using a dirty brush to lay in each of these different value transitions. So in other words, you can't lay in a light value. You can't dip a brush that is dirty with a very dark value into paints that you want to use for a lighter value, because the paint that's on the brush is going to pollute the paint that you're trying to lay down. So you want to keep a clean brush. Some artists actually have several brushes, one for light values, one for dark values. I've never done that. I just keep cleaning my brush. As we get into color, people may run into trouble with what they consider to be dirty color, a difficulty of getting really bright, clean colors in their painting. I find that often that's happening with beginning painters because they're using either dirty mineral spirits or a dirty brush. So you want to keep those materials and tools clean as you're working. So for now, I'm gonna keep dwelling on this. So what do we need to, what's another element of light and shadow that we've talked about, but we haven't completely, or that we haven't indicated on this form? So we talked about it when we were talking about lights and darks, and then that artist who did that video we watched, he talked about this pretty extensively. What's another element of light and shadow that we have not yet painted on this cone?
Highlights.
The highlight, right. So we basically have right now we basically have just one undifferentiated light mass on the white side of the form. As I was talking, just cleaning up, clarifying that shadow edge. And so this kind of painting is, we're constantly adjusting and nudging the values we put down until we get the right, exactly what, until our painting is doing exactly what we want it to do. So in this case, I'm trying to slowly arrive at a depiction of the way the light, the shadow softens into the light and communicates the exact rate of turn of this cone. And that would take me, I would need to continue to work on this. I'm going to, before we go on to the highlight, my drawing is not totally convincing on the ellipse. So I'm going to go back in with nearly black and I'm going to bring in the occlusion shadow. As I'm doing that, I'm going to try to clarify the drawing on my ellipse. Draw the ellipse so that it appears to wrap around in space. So just at the bottom edge of that cone where it meets the cast shadow, that shadow is darker. I'm going to go in and just soften that edge a little bit more. So now we want to look for the highlight. And the highlight on this form is not that, it's not that strong. This is not a highly reflective surface. But there is nevertheless an area, I see just a slight indication of the highlight, a little bit stronger at the top of the cone. As that cone fades out towards the bottom, as the highlight moves towards the bottom, it softens out into the center light. So I will indicate that. So I'm laying just pure white into the paint I have down. And I'm going to soften that out. I don't know if people just noticed, but I just used a dirty brush. Soften that paint.
Oh, you need to charge your camera. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Getting low battery. I don't know why this, I do have it plugged in to a, well, I'm almost done with my demo, so I think my battery will last till the end. Just more of the technical glitches I haven't totally figured out in this process of online teaching.
Is the mall stick like a two-handed thing? Like you kind of hold it up with your left hand?
I hold it with my left hand, yeah.
Okay.
So there's something about the lighting on my painting and the way the camera's capturing it that this shadow edge appears more stark on the camera. So I've worked that edge to soften that edge. Let me see if it makes a difference this around. So
That makes a difference.
does make a difference. Nevertheless, it's a little bit stark. I'll try to send
More blended now.
a photo.
The camera froze.
Yeah, I know. Again, technical glitch. I apologize. I'm afraid I am not. Let me see. I was nearly done with the demo anyway. I just got a error message on the phone that I have never seen before. It said, iPhone has to cool down before you can use it anymore. So
It got too hot.
yeah, I apologize for that. This is all, doing these kinds of online demos is all new to me. So I think we're going to have to leave the demo there, but we did cover all the basic principles of blocking in a painting like this. So give me 1 second, I'm gonna take this off.
Are you gonna put that recording in the?
Yes, I will. I'm going to upload this demo.
So this demo that you did is what we have to do working tomorrow,
Yes.
and then we have to submit it to you after we
Sorry?
finish. Then we have to submit it to you after we finish it.
Yes. So what I'd like you to do is set up. Everybody should have a cone. Actually, let me ask. Does everybody have a cone?
So they just called me saying
I
that they
don't
were
have.
out in the city at Blake. I don't know if there's like another place you recommend getting one from.
Okay, so
I got a cone-shaped object at Michael's. It's not like, you know, it's not a paper cone. It's a foam cone, but it is a cone. So
yeah, you can. Foam cones are relatively common, like at Michael's or at an art supply store. If you get a foam cone, you can just cover it with paper, and that way it will receive light in a way that's adequate. You can also, by the way, if anybody wants to get something like this, you could use a white paper cup. That's essentially a cone, right? It's a cone with the top cut off. But you can't use a white paper cup that has a pattern on it, right? You need to you can use that. You can, I don't remember where I got this, but I think I got it at like a dollar store or something like that. This you can use, don't use plastic, because you don't want the reflective surface of the plastic, but a white standard paper cup. I will also send you a template for how to make a cone. So in other words, it's a template that you can print out if you have a printer, and then you cut it out and it shows you where to glue it. You can also make a paper cone. So try to either buy a cone, I'll send the template, or just use something like this. This is totally fine. Okay.
This one. Professor,
Go ahead.
I have this one.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Can you show me again? Selena, can you show me again? I lost you, I don't know why. Why did I lose you? Where are you? Oh, okay. Yeah, that's great. That's perfect. That came from Dick Blick.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. So I will, so you want to set up a still life like I did again. I'll turn the camera around so you can see the still life setup. So just want to set up, you want to have a setup like this, a cone, again, preferably in a box because you're going to be able to control the lighting much better. You want to have a clip-on light to illuminate it. And you're going to be doing, a still life based on that still life you set up. And again, you want to be carefully looking at the big value relationship. So you want to be trying to in your painting, trying to communicate these differences in values. right? The difference between the fact that the illuminated part of the cone is darker than the values behind it, the value relationships between the light mass and the dark mass. You want to look for and include those elements of light and shadow that we talked about. And I will send you images where those elements of light and shadow are clearly indicated to remind everybody. I'll also send you a link to that video we watched in case anyone wants to refer to that again. So you want to set up a simple still life, illuminated from one side, and doing your best, make a painting that successfully communicates, one, the value relationships that you're looking at, and two, a convincing sense of the three-dimensional volume of that object in the space it's sitting in. Okay. So, this is new. If this is the first time any of you have tried this, you're going to find it to be very difficult, and don't let that discourage you. Doing this kind of painting is very difficult. But it's like anything else. The more you do it, the better you get. So don't let that discourage you. And so, like I said, tomorrow will be an asynchronous session. In other words, tomorrow you should make time, whether it's in the morning or any time during the day, to do, give yourself 3 hours, 3.5 hours to work on this painting. And then, yes, when you're done with it, take a photograph of it. Try to follow those steps I indicated in that, that document that lays out how to photograph a work of art for online submission, and then send me that image. So what I will do, try to send it to me before class starts on Thursday. I'm not going to talk about everybody's painting in depth, but I will talk about just using your paintings in general to talk about where people were successful, where there are some problems, and I'll use that to lead in to the demo I'll do on Thursday.
Professor, sorry. Do we need to log in tomorrow on Zoom?
I'm sorry?
Do we need to log in on Zoom tomorrow?
No, tomorrow is asynchronous. So tomorrow you will be working on your own.
Okay, thank you.
And I will be available during class time. If anyone needs to get in touch with me, if you want to FaceTime me and show me what you're working on, or if you want to send me an in-progress image, if anyone needs any feedback from me, I'll be available from 9 to 12:50 tomorrow during class time, okay? Like I said, if you are doing the painting at a different time tomorrow, you can try me, but I can't guarantee that I'm gonna be available, but you can always try, okay?
Professor, tomorrow we have to send you the final product, right? So
yeah, send it to me by any time before class on Thursday.
Okay.
On Thursday morning, okay?
Professor, do we have to email you the painting picture?
Yes. How else would you do it? You mean upload it to Blackboard?
I can email you.
Yeah, emails. Let's stick with email for now.
I've got just a question if you have tips on cleaning the brushes.
Oh, that's actually, I'm really glad you asked.
Because
okay.
I used oil paint like once before many years ago, and I remember that being like a project.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So actually, what I'm going to do right now, I always show people how to clean brushes when we're meeting in class. I'm just going to look to see if there's a good, while we're all together here, I'm going to see if there's a good demo online. Let's see if there's anything. I'll share my screen. So
Wipe it off with a paper towel. Use water to thoroughly clean them, like this. You can use weeks, the way I've just explained. Aren't going to be the bristles from brushes. Also, one last thing, I've just launched the Patreon.
Oh my God, that person annoys me so much. I've seen her videos. There are these tons of people who do these online painting videos. They're all so annoying. Let me see. Okay, I won't take up your time. I'll see if I can find a good one. But let me just show you very briefly. Or let me show as best I can on right here. So the first thing you want to do, let me actually change this orientation so you guys can see my table in the light. Okay, so can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do, I have here my jar of mineral spirits. And I have all of my brushes that I used today, and I used quite a few. So these all have paint on them. So the first thing you wanna do is simply give them a good soaking. You can rub the brushes against the bottom of the jar in your mineral spirits and get rid of the bulk of the paint. That gets rid of most of it. But that's not going to clean your brushes in a way that will make them last as long as possible. But that's the first step. It's very simple. Again, you just clean them off kind of vigorously, but you want to be conscious of, you don't want to clean, you don't want to dip these brushes in a way that, you damage the bristles. So as I'm rubbing the brushes against the bottom of the jar, I'm rubbing them so that I'm maintaining the direction of the bristles. Okay? So I don't have a sink in my studio, so I can't show you how to sink. But then I'm going to bring these to a sink, okay? And I'm going to use soap. It can be pump soap or it can be a bar of soap. And I'll sort of show you this without water. I'm going to put soap in my hand. And then I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to just pass it through the soap. Obviously, you want to do this at a sink. And that soap, and it can be any soap. It can be dish soap, it can be hand soap, it can be shampoo, it can be laundry detergent, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to, rub it through the soap, and I can push the soap through the bristles like this. Again, being conscious of the direction of the bristle. I don't want to turn the bristle against its direction because that'll damage the brush. I just want to rub that soap through the bristle. And then obviously I'm going to rinse it out in the water, rinse the soap out thoroughly. I'm going to shape the brush at the end. I'll shape it. I'll dry it like that, and then I'll leave it out to dry. And your brushes will be, they might have a little bit of a staining of the oil paint color, but they'll be clean, and you'll maintain your brushes in a usable condition for a long time. Eventually you have to replace your brushes because they wear down like anything else. But it is, I highly recommend thoroughly cleaning your brushes with soap and water at the end of every painting session. So let me show you one other thing. So does anybody here have a permanent palette, or does everybody have the paper palettes?
I have a permanent plastic palette.
Okay, so have you ever used it before?
Nope.
Okay, so let me just show people how to clean your painting surface. So let's say, I'm gonna take the paint we used here. So you have a palette that has all this paint on it. I'll use this old paint. So you have a palette with all that paint on it. So you want to take your palette knife and just use it to scrape as much of that paint off as you can. And then take that old paint and wipe your palette knife. Be careful when you wipe your palette knife. A palette knife, when you first buy it, it's dull, but it can be a little bit sharp. And as you use a palette knife over time, you're actually sharpening it. So I've cut myself really bad when wiping a palette. So just be careful. You want to make sure you're not cutting through the paper or the rag and cutting yourself. So you wipe that off. And then I have right here, I have pinned to the side of my painting table, I have a plastic bag for my trash. So I'm going to throw that into the trash. Okay, I'm not going to throw that into regular trash. I have a separate trash for oil painting. So I've cleaned off most of that paint. I'll take another paper towel and use it to wipe the bulk of the rest of it. I'll throw that in the trash. And then I'll dip a paper towel in mineral spirits, wipe the rest of that, and then just dry that mineral spirits. Okay, so with oil paint, you can't clean a palette with soap and water. So don't bring this over to your sink. You want to scrape off the paint with your palette knife, dispose of the scrapings in your trash, and then give a light wipe with mineral spirits. Okay, so I think an important thing for people working at home, if people still have access to plastic bags, I would recommend having one of these for trash. And then if you're concerned about disposing of oily rags, I used to have a studio at home. I used to use my living room at my apartment as my studio. And generally, I'm not worried about the materials of oil paint in the home. You know, if you use it in a smart way, they're perfectly safe. But people might be genuinely concerned about having rags with mineral spirits or rags with oil on them disposed of in your home. So one thing to do is, if you can, just take that bag and put it in the outside trash right away. But if you want to be really safe about it, you can just saturate those rags in the plastic bag with water. And then just wrap that up and throw it away. It's a very safe way to get rid of your rags. Just put them in a dedicated plastic bag, saturate them with water, and just toss that in the trash. And again, for complete safety, I'm not saying you need to do this, but for complete safety, if anybody's concerned, maybe just throw it in the outside trash. Just for peace of mind. I think that covers everything. Are there any other questions? And please let me know if there's anything that people are unclear about regarding how to set up or how to deal with your materials at home. I'm very happy to answer any of those questions. So we talked about how to set up your palette, how to deal with your mineral spirits, how to clean the palette, clean the brushes, dispose of any rags. Is there any other questions that people have?
Professor, I have one question about. I have a question about the brushes. So I bought the brushes that you recommended, and which brushes do we need to use for this cone painting?
Well, so brushes, it's a little bit of a preference. I tried to give a small range so you can experiment. You know, I would, for blocking in the large masses, I would use the biggest brush. What was that, a number 6 that I asked you to buy? And then for blocking in the cone, you know, maybe use that number 2. I don't have the list in front of me, but the number 2 filbert. If you're doing some of the smaller things, you can use the, did I ask you to buy a number 1 round?
I don't remember the exact number.
No.
We have 2, 4, 6, and 8.
2, 4, 6, and 8, what, filbert?
Yeah.
Okay, so those are very useful brushes. So 2, 4, 6, and 8, about these sizes. And those sizes are fairly standard. So they're about these sizes. I would use, you know, the brush that's that big or the closest to that big to block in the large areas. I would use this to draw, and for the smaller areas, you know, and then this for the medium-sized areas. And again, you can experiment with that. The brushes that people use are somewhat of a, it's a preference. So let me see if I have.
Professor, if while we're working tomorrow, if you wanted to get in touch with you to maybe get feedback while we're in progress, would texting you be the best way to reach you?
Yes, I would text me. Yeah, and then if necessary, you can send me an image or we can do a FaceTime. But yeah, text me at first.
Okay. I just wanted to confirm your text, your phone number, if that's all right. Yeah. Is it 917-742-0737?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
So brushes, and you know, people, I recommended a starter set. People are obviously, you know, I would encourage people, if you're interested, to experiment with other brushes. You know, here's a large, this is a flat, maybe this is a filbert. This is a number 18. You know, we're not going to do paintings that large that need that. You know, this is a filbert brush is a brush that's relatively long and it curves at the top. So there are other kinds of brushes. There are also brushes that are called flats. Let me see if I have one. I don't use them, but a lot of artists do. No, I don't use them anymore, so I don't have any left. A flat is similar to a filbert, but it's straight all the way up. And then brights are shorter, stubbier bristles. You know, some artists like that. I mean, I paint with filberts because it's my preference. Some artists paint with brights. Some artists paint exclusively with brushes that are called rounds. So they're brushes that are shaped like that. That's really a preference. I mean, I can give some recommendations, but my recommendations are only going to go so far. You know, again, because you develop your own preferences. I would encourage people, if it's possible, to experiment a bit. You know, if anyone has the time and the inclination to make another visit to an art supply store, to get a few different brushes to try, I think that's not a bad idea. I think it's an excellent idea. Just to show you some other brushes I've used. So then I used a fan brush today. So that's called a fan brush, and these are used for blending generally. So I have seen some people paint with these. These are generally used for blending, and the softer ones are better. I use these brushes that look a little bit like makeup brushes, and although you buy these in an art supply store. And I use these again to blend, a dry brush. So again, brushes can be expensive. I didn't want to give you a supply list that was too expensive. But definitely if people want to experiment with brushes like that, I really encourage it. You know, and I really do encourage people to, you know, try different materials so that you find out what you like. You know, if people who have taken classes at Queens College in the recent past, when we were still working on campus, you'll know that we buy material, or most of the materials, for students. And I think that's good because it saves money for you all. I do think that there's a downside to that, which is that it just creates a situation where students are less inclined to go into the art supply store themselves and do their own shopping or do their own experimenting with brushes and other things to use for making art. So I do definitely encourage you to do that. You know, again, if you have the inclination, have the time, you know, and art supplies can be expensive. So that's also an issue. But certainly if anyone has any questions about brushes, I'm very happy to answer those questions.
I have another question.
Sure.
I bought the jar I just bought. The lid is not fully sealed. So I just tested with water. So it's okay for the mineral spirits?
I'm sorry, the lid is not what?
Not fully sealed. So because I just test with the water and the water will drip a little bit.
Yeah, that's okay. Just you know, I would just be careful with it. But that's okay. I use I don't have it. Sometimes I use a coffee can, you know, with those plastic lids, or one of these. I sometimes use these, and these are not totally watertight either. But you know, this is actually a good. One of these is good. One of these old-fashioned coffee cans is good for your mineral spirits. You know, you just want to be careful where you keep it. So that's okay. Anybody else?
Do you think it's okay to work outside? Like if you have like a backyard that's pretty big enough that you can work outside?
Well, I mean, as long as you can control the lighting so that what you're working on has a consistent light the entire time you're working. I mean, if you're able to create a situation like that, it's fine. The other thing about working outside is depending on how hot it gets. I've worked outside painting landscapes, and it can be difficult, you know, if it's a hot day. But if you're able to have a situation where you're working in shadow, that should work. Do you know what I mean? Like if you're in the shadow of your house or something like that. I mean, if you're working in direct sun, it's going to get tricky.
No, yeah, like I have a roof, like a little house kind of thing outside in my garage, in my backyard. So
yeah, if you can make it work so that you're still able to have a setup, so that you know your still life setup with a controlled light that stays consistent, then that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Professor, did you send us the Photoshop app? You told us like that is free.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you send me an email and I will I'll look up that program and send it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, we have to send one photograph, right, Professor?
You have to what?
Send you one photograph of my image, right?
Yes, just one. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Okay, so let me just look at the questions in the chat. I never noticed the chat. Okay. Okay, are there any questions there that haven't been answered? Which canvas should we use? Yeah, canvas pad is fine. Or canvas board. Yeah. Okay, so let me know. You can email me if anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, I'll end the session for today. Again, tomorrow will be asynchronous, where you'll be working on your own, and you can contact me. I'll be available from 9 to 12:50. Okay?
I have a quick question. How do you normally like grade, like if we send it in, how do you normally grade it? Like do you grade it through Blackboard?
Yeah, I don't like Blackboard, I have to say. And I'm not totally consistent about using Blackboard, but yes, I do grade it. what I mean by that is you won't see the grade immediately, but I have been trying to grade each assignment on Blackboard so you have a sense of how you're doing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so I'll see everybody Thursday, and anyone who needs to talk to me, again, I'll be available tomorrow. Okay, so email any questions, don't hesitate if anyone needs any clarification about anything. Okay?
I just want to apologize for being late today.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay.
I think that I messaged you and forgot to put
I
my name in the text.
No, I got your text. I mean, I figured it out.
Uh-huh.
I figured out who it was eventually.
All right.
Okay, so I will see you all on Thursday.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor. Bye.